Welcome to this special episode of Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. With Halloween upon us, we thought it would be a good idea to discuss Yiddish horror, European Jewish stories steeped in lore about demons, dibbiks, golems, ghosts, spirits, succubi, and more. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Cool Shul Jewish Cultural Community, and Atheists United Studios.
Our special guest today is Elizabeth Schwartz, an author, filmmaker, and singer who has been called the Edith Piaf of Yiddish. She's the vocalist of the Klezmer group Yale Strom Hot Pstromi, and the subject of a Romanian documentary film, Searching for Schwartz. Elizabeth co-created the award-winning audio dramas The Witches of Lublin and Debs in Canton, contributed a chapter on Klezmer vocal technique to Shpil, the Art of Playing Klezmer, and has recipes in A Wandering Feast, A Journey Through the Jewish Culture of Eastern Europe, and other publications. Her first book of fiction, The Sweet Fragrance of Life and Other Horror Stories, was released a short while ago, just in time for Halloween. Elizabeth, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
The Sweet Fragrance of Life collects 3 original horror stories set in the Old Country and written in both Yiddish and English. What inspired you to take this bilingual approach?
My work is very steeped in Yiddish and Yiddishkeit as first and foremost, a klezmer musician. But when I'm not working, I'm a really avid reader, like I think all writers. But this is a medium of writing that I had never tried before. And I'll be honest, I was looking for this to read, this genre of feminist shtetl horror, and I couldn't find it. I mean, there is, as you mentioned, there's a wonderful tradition of Jewish horror, much of it written originally in Yiddish, but not really told from a woman's point of view or in ways that I think are things that women are thinking about or concerned about or grappling with. And I couldn't find it. And that sort of got me interested in doing it.
Very cool. And just for our viewers, the book is truly bilingual. So if you look at it this way, it's going to be in English. You flip it around, it's in Yiddish, and they meet in the middle, which is quite a beautiful thing. So without giving too much away, we absolutely want our audience to buy the book, of course. Could you tell us a little bit about the title, The Sweet Fragrance of Life, which is also the title of the middle story? Is this sweetness of the fragrance perhaps challenged, or does it come into focus through the foregrounding of death in your book and in the horror genre more broadly?
It's actually not a phrase that I wrote. It is from a song cycle written by Mahler called Song of the Earth. And it's a lyric in the song cycle which struck me because Sweet Fragrance of Life, what could be better than that? It's so dark and it's really menacing. And I loved that juxtaposition. And I didn't write the story because of it, but it really fits so perfectly and neatly, particularly with the characters. I don't want to say too much, but with the characters who share it and sing it together and are both love Mahler and think that they have so much in common, and of course they don't.
I was riffing on the idea of that lyric myself as I read the Mahler translation. And, you know, the fragrance of life can be a menacing thing in the sense that, you know, that's what attracts predators, right? The blood, perhaps, that attracts the shark or the zombie or whatever. You know, it's sort of like a dangerous thing to have the fragrance of life. It attracts death in a way.
That is so good. I wish I had thought about that when I was writing this story. That's a great way to look at it. I want the title to make sense after you read the story and then you think about everything that has transpired with this, with these 2 characters in particular and their relationship and I think I even in this story reference smells quite a bit of the different people, which is something that I tend to do anyway. But I realize I think all my stories have smells in them, and it's just I have a very sensitive nose. So I guess I'm not a dog, but it's one of my first things I think I encounter. Oh.
And that makes sense. The two strongest senses that we have are hearing and smell, and you're a musician who talks about smell. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
So the stories in your book are feminist, as you said, yet the female protagonists don't have a lot of agency and are more often victims who get the last laugh. Perhaps revenge was the best women could hope for in those restricted times and places. What's the feminist takeaway?
There's no escaping that world, and the stories really are, including the last one, which is certainly based on a historic event. The stories are really very deeply rooted in actual Jewish history and culture, and little of that is actually woman-centric. So in the first story, for example, I really objectify the women to the point where they are just sort of tools for the protagonist. What makes them feminist? Not that there is justice or egalitarianism, but that the historic treatment of women in many cases does not go unnoticed or treated casually or, God forbid, even rewarded in any way.
Yeah, one of the things I appreciate about the stories too is that you take this formula that I've heard from R.L. Stine and, the great Jewish author himself, and of course other Jewish contributors to science fiction, horror, etc. This idea of like the beginning, the middle, and the twist. I'm wondering if that's rooted in the Yiddish lore from your experience. Is that kind of the essence as a way of saying of those kinds of stories?
Most adult views of folklore, not things that are simplified or moralized for children, but when you think of I.B. Singer, for example, who wrote in Yiddish, his this wryness, these things are, I think, what make interesting reading or things that you think about afterwards. I mean, it's certainly not him. If you've read, for example, Roald Dahl, I know he's canceled at the moment, but his adult short stories, they all have these kind of twists. My actual inspiration was more like the author Angela Carter, who in the 1970s, it was kind of mind-blowing for me as a child who read and adored all of the Andrew Lang fairy books and devoured fairy tales, to, as a young woman, read her stories where she basically turned all of these fairy tales on their head with, I would go so far as to say, with a feminist, female-centric point of view that changed your perceptions of these classic stories, because she made us realize how easy that was to do if we just changed our perspectives.
So many have observed that the horror genre in the West is mostly dominated by Christian imagery and Christian ideas about morality and ethics. Some horror stories, and especially in film, can actually function as a kind of Christian propaganda. An extreme case in point, back in the early 2000s, I played cello on the soundtrack of a terrible B-movie called Exorcism, not to be confused with The Exorcist, which turned out to be a polemical evangelical Protestant attack on Catholicism. So I'm wondering if you see the Jewish reclaiming of horror through your book and other recent books and comics and films, including a movie by one of our past guests, Noah Sagan, called Blood Relatives, as a corrective, perhaps, to the genre's Christian hegemony.
Like the most iconic horror story of all time, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley based that on the golem. So there really, there are some underpinnings of Jewish culture and historical context for these stories. What is kind of changed, of course, are the circumstances of, why somebody gets possessed or why this creature starts wreaking havoc. I mean, obviously Frankenstein doesn't deal with the context of, anti-Semitism in Prague in I think it was the 16th century. There are only so many stories to go around. And we're always looking for new ways to tell them. So what I appreciate a lot is really just in the past decade, there has been so much interest in Yiddish and Yiddish culture. And there have been some horror films that are, Yiddish or based like in the Hasidic enclaves in Brooklyn. And that's really heartening that people are starting to plumb that and interested in exploring those worlds.
Yeah, that's a great way of contextualizing it too. I was in a klezmer group in the early 2000s, affiliated with John Zorn's Sadiq Records and all that stuff. And that was very hot in that moment. But I think you're right, that's sort of cooled in terms of like being a cultural movement. And maybe this is the next phase of that energy, maybe filtered more through literature, visual arts, that kind of thing.
What's interesting to me is the phenomenon of Shul, which, I mean, you don't need to promote Israeli culture. It's there. I mean, it's a vibrant nation. But this Yiddish enclave and kind of exploring that world and, sort of our excitement at hearing characters speaking Yiddish, and then following up with the Shira House film, Unorthodox, I mean, it's really, these are also obviously about Hasidic culture, but that is really the community that is speaking Yiddish as a living daily language. And it's just, I'm enjoying seeing people starting to discover this. So yes, you're right. Unfortunately, those of us who continue to play klezmer and try and push the envelope and are committed to it are still committed to the art form. We're just not kind of anti-disestablishmentarian about it.
Right. Well, everything that begins as radical, if it lasts, becomes sort of part of the mainstream. So there's something positive about that too.
So, as we know, Jews in Europe historically experienced all sorts of real-life horrors, from violent attacks to extreme poverty to devastating disease and infant mortality. Was the invention of Dybbuk and demons perhaps a way to make sense of all this by giving a supernatural rationale to the seeming randomness of actual horrors?
We are literary people. We have always been literally the people and figuratively the people of the book. So literacy has been an aspect of Judaism in the modern age. But I do think that fictionalizing the monsters that were other human beings and externalizing them and making them, something other could be a way to explore it, explain it, think about it without feeling personally threatened, or, give it some perspective, move it away from your daily life. Don't forget that the golem was written as a character created to protect the Jews.
Yeah. And we saw how that worked out. So a Halloween-specific question. There are a lot of religious Jews who object to observing Halloween because of its presumed pagan origins, Christian overlays, and so forth. Halloween has always been a favorite holiday of mine, so I never really took those critiques very seriously. But I'm wondering if maybe we can make the holiday a little more Jewish by using it as an opportunity to celebrate and to remember our own horror folklore, which, as you're saying, is rooted in stories from the Talmud and the Hebrew Bible anyway. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Oh, I have lots of thoughts about that. First of all, Halloween is my favorite Chag, I've always said. I am a full-size candy bar person, none of these fun size. I have one of the good houses. Separate from that, I understand that there may be some religious objections to it. I'm not Orthodox, and I don't live in an Orthodox community. And when I was growing up, the biggest objection about Halloween was we were back east, and you'd get this great costume, and you'd have to put a parka over it. So I I know that the objection has not always been, Jewish. I mean, I think that it's considered a pagan holiday, and that there were Christians who objected to it too. I also happen to love paganism, and I consider myself a Yiddish pagan, and I see the antecedents of all of our faiths in this kind of early religious world. So,
yeah, I have several sweet teeth. I don't have a sweet tooth. So I'm with you on that. And also, you're absolutely right. If we take the slippery slope into critiquing and discarding anything that has a smell of paganism, we don't have any Judaism anymore, because of the roots of everything that we think of as Jewish or Christian culture. If you dig deep enough, you find exactly what the objectors are objecting to. So I think Halloween is beautiful. I wish I would see more kids dressing up like golems and Dybbuk, but maybe that'll happen.
The other thing I wanted to mention is that, in the final story in the book, it's a story about a girl who doesn't use her voice, and that is in many cultures throughout the millennia, and in many religions, a woman's voice has had a lot of weight and associations attached to it. The whole ban on Kol Isha in Jewish culture, and which I have also had to deal with quite a lot as a vocalist. It kind of is like, oh, okay, here we go again. There is something about being robbed of your agency and not using your voice, which is also, I guess, my response to my experiences kind of swimming in those waters of an Orthodox traditional world as a non-Orthodox woman singer.
You're always busy with different projects. What's new and upcoming, and how can we find out more?
Well, I do try to keep up with my website, which is www.elizabeth-schwartz.com. And there's a lot of stuff on there. It does seem like we're doing a lot of things all at once, and that's really because, so much stuff was percolating and in the works during the pandemic or immediately after the pandemic. So it seems like it's like a crazy amount of activity, but really this was all just happening slowly, getting ready to come out. We just had our new album released on the Naxos Arc Music label. This was a recording we made last year in a former synagogue. Well, it's still a synagogue. It just doesn't have a Jewish community or a Torah or anything, in Polishov, Czech Republic. And it's a beautifully preserved synagogue that's noted because the rabbi who had been there, who is known as the Shah, and that's what they call that, which is an acronym of his name, was a very important Torah commentator. So there are still pilgrimages made every year to Holishov to go to his grave and to see the synagogue, which is now a museum. But we just recorded this album live in the synagogue as a way to kind of have oxygen and Jewish music and flowing through it again, and playing music that is the kind of music from communities that would have come to Holishov, or that the Jews of Holishov might have gone to and heard, including one song based on a poem that is written in a dialect of Yiddish from Eastern Austria, from the Burgenland, called Burgenlandish Yiddish. That's extinct. There's no one who speaks that any longer. I think that there are artists who work in a medium who say, okay, I finished this project. What's the next thing I'm going to write? But my focus is really on this world, and then I kind of explore it in as many different media as I can.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to talk to you.
I really appreciate it, guys. I wish you a Freilichen Halloween.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.